All right, and we're back. We are continuing our discussion of a case study involving signal transduction pathways. And we had just gone over this particular pathway that was talking about cell growth and division. Now, at this point, we have covered the primary mechanisms that you will see on the AP test involving transduction. So we've looked at relay proteins, we've looked at enzyme intermediates, we've looked at second messengers, and we've looked at kinases. So those are going to be the main, I would say, components of transduction that you'll see on the AP test and on your FRQs. A lot of times what you'll see is that the FRQ or the MCQ will involve analyzing an image like this and having to interpret what a potential result will be if something is mutated in this example. So for example, if the G protein couple receptor was mutated, what would potentially happen and what would be the cellular response? So now we're talking about the cellular response, and this is going to lead us into that case study involving the fight or flight response. So the molecular response is going to be DNA expression and then the cytoplasmic response. So the proteins, like we saw in the last diagram, or excuse me, 2 diagrams ago, like these proteins here, those are part of the response before, or excuse me, these proteins over here, the production of the proteins before cell division, those are the primary proteins that are going to be part of response, but not transduction. Anything that happens before transcription and translation and or the cell doing something, that's all transduction. But if this DNA has been transcribed, if there is a cellular response or if there's a physiological response, that's all considered part and parcel of the response portion of a signal transduction pathway, right? So that's just a brief summary of kind of what the response actually is, right? It's everything after transduction typically occurs or anything that is causing the cell to respond. Now let's go back to the case study. Now, why do I have a snake as the image for this case study? Well, the reason for that is because I am terrified of snakes, truly, genuinely, consistently terrified of snakes. And so when I see the snake, when I was Google searching images for this slide deck, I was looking at these images of snakes and genuinely my whole body hurt. My stomach dropped. I felt like I was starting to sweat, like my face flushed, like it just genuinely caused a physical reaction in my body. So the question I'm asking is, what is causing that fight or flight response? When Miss Bear sees a snake, what is causing the fight or flight response? And there's a specific signal transduction pathway that does this. So you get a lot of different symptoms of the fight or flight response. You get pale or flushed skin. You can get rapid heart rate, trembling, dilated pupils. There's also the freeze response, which is a lot of times looped into the fight or flight response. And that's going to have a lot of the same things, a lot of trembling and those kinds of responses. So every cell in your body is going to experience some combination of the following symptoms. So this is going to require an immense amount of energy. Now I want you to think back to Unit 3. Think about energy in cells. What is going to be required in order for energy to be proliferated throughout the cells? What is your body going to need a lot of in order for it to get enough energy to do these things? Have you thought about it yet? The big hint here is cell respiration. We are going to need glucose. We're going to need immense amounts of glucose in order for this process to occur. In fact, it's going to need more glucose typically than you have floating around in your bloodstream. So what is our body going to do, right? Well, you could potentially eat a meal. But you're not going to eat a meal if you're in the middle of the fight or flight response. That's not going to give you the glucose that you need. So what are we going to do? How are we going to get the sugar that we need? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can get it. The main way that I'm going to talk about is through this molecule glycogen. So glycogen is a gigantic glucose net, essentially, that is a bunch of smaller glucose molecules. I'm going to zoom in on this picture because this picture here is a glycogen molecule. And I'm going to zoom in. On the middle here, we have a protein, and the protein acts like an anchor. But all of the smaller molecules on the outside of it, those are going to be glucose molecules stuck together. So what our body does in response to this fight or flight response is it's going to go to the liver where we store the bulk of our glycogen is in the liver, and it is going to release glucagon. Now, normally, glycogen is stored in the liver and muscle cells as well when your body lacks glucose. But in the fight or flight response, we have to access those glucose reserves. So how are we going to access those glucose reserves? Well, it has to do with a signal transduction pathway. We've seen this image before. We just saw it actually in the last video. And I want you to take a look. What do you notice about the response portion of this image? Exactly. At this point, epinephrine, another name for epinephrine, is adrenaline. If you've ever been on a roller coaster, you know the feeling of having an adrenaline rush. The same thing is happening in the fight or flight response. Epinephrine is going to trigger a signal transduction pathway, and it's going to inhibit glycogen synthesis. So it's going to keep glucose from being turned into glycogen in your liver. It's going to keep that from happening. But it's also going to promote glycogen breakdown within your liver. It's going to start breaking down this big old molecule of glycogen. It's going to start breaking that down into smaller glucose pieces. And this is because epinephrine is released from the adrenal glands as a result of the adrenaline rush. And it's going to rush and flood through your body in an attempt to send this signal to the rest of your body, like, hey, we need to get out of here. Something is wrong, right? So based on this image, how does epinephrine affect glycogen formation and breakdown? I want you to take a second to answer that in your notes. I just explained this actually, so if you need to, pause the video and go back, and you can rewatch my explanation in order to answer this question. Additionally, I would like you to answer the following. Does this mean that glucose levels in the blood will increase or decrease in the presence of epinephrine? And what is another term for blood glucose levels? Have you had a chance to think about it? Well, does this mean that glucose levels in the blood will increase or decrease? Glucose levels are going to increase because glycogen is going to be released from the liver and the muscles, and it's going to enter into the bloodstream. Now, what is another term for blood glucose levels? Blood sugar. So they've actually been able to measure this. And after the fight or flight response has been initiated, people's blood sugar spikes a lot. It increased levels of blood sugar as glycogen stops being made and is increasingly broken down into glucose. So this is just another representation of how this process works. Epinephrine is going to signal to adenylyl cyclase. It's going to turn it into ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is going to amplify the signal, and it's going to cause glycogen to be broken down into glucose, and it's not going to make any more glycogen. Right? So that same process. And they've actually been able to find that people who have, well, here's the thing. Let's go back for a second, because high blood sugar is known to be a bad thing. We know that high blood sugar can be really dangerous for us if we have it for a prolonged period of time. And what scientists have found is that people who experience the fight or flight response frequently, for example, people that experience consistent and frequent trauma, people who experience traumatic, for example, childhoods, they tend to have higher rates of blood sugar disorders. So they tend to have higher rates of coronary artery disease and high blood sugar and things like that. They tend to have higher rates of that because their blood sugar tends to stay high for such a long period of time. So this is a really interesting connection between mental health, and physiology. Now let's take a look at an example. So this epinephrine receptor, or this epinephrine molecule, the adrenaline molecule, is going to act on multiple different types of cells. So that's what we're looking at in this diagram. Epinephrine is going to act not just on your liver cells, it's also going to act on your blood vessels. And not only are the blood vessels and the liver cells going to have different responses, so are certain blood vessels. So let's take a look at this. In this diagram, on the left-hand side, right, we have the same receptor. So the green receptor is the same receptor, but different intracellular proteins. So the proteins here aren't being shown, but the mechanism, the transduction pathway, is different for a liver cell compared to a skeletal muscle cell, right? So the same receptors, but a different intracellular protein. And this is going to induce different cellular responses. In the liver cell, epinephrine is going to trigger glycogen to break down and release, and it's going to cause that glucose to be released from the cell. But the same signal, epinephrine, is going to trigger the blood vessel to dilate in your skeletal muscles. Why on earth would epinephrine cause your skeletal muscles, your blood vessels and your skeletal muscles to dilate? Because it's getting you ready to run away. It siphons all of the blood, it makes your blood vessels bigger, so more blood goes to your skeletal muscles, and it causes your skeletal muscles to become active. And so it's preparing you for having to flee or run away. Now, in the same breath, the intestinal blood vessels, epinephrine triggers a different response because there's a different receptor. In this intestinal blood vessel, epinephrine is going to cause the blood vessel to constrict. Why would we want less blood flow to our digestive system during the fight or flight response? Because you don't need to digest a sandwich while you're running away from a snake, right? So epinephrine is going to be involved in a variety of different signal transduction pathways depending on what cell is receiving the signal. So how does a hormone affect different types of cells? I just explained this, so I want you to take a second, explain this for yourself, and then if you need to, you can go back and rewatch that portion of the video. Same with this question. Why does the same signal have a different effect on these cells, right? And it has to do with transduction because transduction is not pictured in these images. So if you need to, go back and take a look at my explanation, and then you can try to explain it for yourself. Okay. All right. So we're getting into the nitty-gritty details of how your body responds to the fight or flight response and what exactly is happening in the fight or flight response, right? So I want you to try to explain, how does epinephrine alter glucose concentration? And how is it going to also alter blood sugar, right? So take a second to think about that question. Is that the last slide that we've got for today? I think that is. So that's going to be the end of this discussion about the fight or flight response. And again, I encourage you to go back to these initial questions at the very beginning. What causes the experience of fight or flight response in mammals? And think about everything that we just saw and how we can see how all of those symptoms of the fight or flight response, increased heart rate, tremors, blood vessel dilation. We just saw how a signal transduction pathway can trigger all of those. So hopefully that was somewhat interesting to you. Again, the worksheet that is associated with these lecture slides is going to be attached in the video notes. And if you're in my class, then you can also get the printout of it when you come into class. Hopefully that was helpful, guys.